Was there any affectation in this? Was he playing a part? Did he believe what he said? Why not? Is it not known how quickly a man accustoms himself to the most extraordinary situations and how quickly he absorbs their tone and spirit? It is not necessary that the title should be authentic in order that he who has possessed himself of it should recognize his proud position and take the keenest delight in it. The arms he bore were usurped, and he knew it, but he was not the less satisfied with them. He found it quite natural that the title prince should be given to him, and highness by itself seemed paltry. But what was he after all? None of the things he affected to be, but his state of mind had become such that he would have been greatly astounded and deeply hurt if he had been reminded from whence he sprang and what his correct title should be. A strange kind of aberration was developed in his mind. On one point, he ceased to keep in touch with reality, and he took for truth the fictions which he had invented himself. He walked in his own dream, and none was able to awaken him. If such intoxication before an empty glass could come over a man who in no way resembled Napoleon, why should the drunkenness be less profound of him who had drained deep cups of glory? Why should not Napoleon, in his life of prodigies, have acquired and kept the opinion that he was a prodigy himself? Why should not the man who believed destiny have formed the conviction that his providential destiny had been recognized by the interpreter of the Godhead, and that the consecration had been the affirmation of it? Thenceforward, it is impossible not to see that Napoleon, convinced that he was a sovereign and had acquired by the consecration the character and state of sovereignty, considered himself the equal of other sovereigns, and relinquished the idea that he could only be their enemy to assume a second, that he could not only live at peace with them, but could enter into their alliances, penetrate into their family circles, and become their brother. The revolution from whence he sprang and of which he was a product was abolished by the consecration. France had renewed her dynasty. After the Capetians came the Napoleons. Were there not sovereigns in Europe whose dynasties were almost as recent, who owed their crown to a series of assassinations, and whose titles rested on the acclamation of a few hired regiments? Why they and not him? What was the difference between them and him? Why were they sought after rather than he? If fresh victories were necessary to abase their pride, he would win them. But thenceforward, there was no reason why they should not associate on an equality and enter into friendship. For such was his belief, it may be thought that such impressions were derived at once from the consecration which hallowed them, the imperialism which was their source, and the inward feeling of Napoleon that he was born to command. But without the consecration, at least as far as the equality of origin was concerned, they would not have reached such a state of development. As to the quality of authority, the mistake was similar but inverse. Napoleon was aware of his imperial power. He knew and felt himself dictator. He acted as such in his absolutism, and he had the disposal of all the strength and resources of the nation. He was under no obligation to take counsel concerning his policy. As he was himself to say, having always followed his own decision, he has no excuse for laying a fault upon anyone else. From this conception of authority, which he applied not only to that exercised by himself, but to that exercised by men endued with a title similar or analogous to his own, sprang the greater part of the errors which he committed in his foreign policy. He had treated personally with the Pope of Paris. He had obtained from him concessions of a certain kind, such as the Pope at Rome had refused. He remained convinced that he exercised decisive influence over the Pope, and that the Pope would thenceforth walk in the way he appointed. The Pope seemed to him to be an absolute sovereign, such as he was himself in his own empire, that he had only to speak to be obeyed. However, after the return of the Pope to Rome, he met with the same resistance that he had experienced during the negotiation for the coronation, and he met with it continually in his quarrel with Pius VII, except at Fontainebleau in January 1813, when he was once more able to treat with him personally. But 2 months afterwards, the Pope repudiated his signature and openly went back upon his word. This absolute sovereign was in reality the prisoner of the Sacred College. The cardinals were his masters. He hesitated and trembled before them and could exercise his supposed infallibility only when it served the hates, passions, and superstitions of a camarilla, which hands down throughout the ages the secret of good doctrines. And it was the same at Tilsit and after Tilsit with the Emperor Alexander, whom he believed to be an absolute sovereign because Alexander bore the title of autocrat. It was the same with his sacred imperial majesty, the Emperor Francis, after the Austrian marriage. Whether it was as now the College of Cardinals or as then a union of family and aristocratic interests mattered little. The sovereign was in leading strings and had only the appearance of authority, even if he sincerely wished it. He was dependent upon those who did not wish it, and whether he liked it or not, he followed their lead. Napoleon thought that he was treating with one such as himself, whereas in reality he was only treating with the irresponsible and perhaps unwitting representative of the oligarchs who pushed forward the crown puppet and made him exchange signatures and oaths which were accounted for nothing. The sovereigns of Europe, whether pope or emperors, were the agents of an aristocracy which varied in its procedure according to the different countries, but which everywhere pursued the same design: the humiliation of France and the destruction of the work of the revolution. Of this work, Bonaparte, whatever he might do, remained the chief constructor. Accordingly, with him, no agreement was possible on one side, as on the other, agreement would mean abdication and suicide. Napoleon could attempt to associate himself with kings, to enter their family circles, and to graft his brother, his adopted son, the distant relations of Josephine, and himself upon them, but he could not associate with the aristocrats. They engaged lackeys, whom they paid for open or secret service on the condition of their possessing the qualifications required of them, but they would never have submitted to a master, and such was Bonaparte. What was it to them that Napoleon had or had not been consecrated by the supreme pontiff of the Catholics? They had no religion in common. Catholics in Rome and Vienna, Lutherans in Berlin, Orthodox in Petersburg, and Anglicans at London. They held no dogma of morality. Some of them, I know country. They formed the Federation, which in continental Europe at least exchanged alliances, entered into relationships, and carried on intrigues across frontiers, of which it reckoned little, and in spite of disguises which were assumed at certain times by some of its members, it mattered little. The Federation would find them staunch when the moment came, and moreover, were they not always its servants? It had spies in the enemy's camp who were paid by the enemy, a twofold advantage. Until the coming of Napoleon, some reliance could be felt in coalitions between the sovereigns and the French governments. The sovereigns have asked for peace, and the governments have treated for alliances. So the matter's then settled? By no means. Never will the aristocrats make peace with the revolution. Never will they ally themselves to Bonaparte. They desired him to be not vanquished, but overthrown, and in chains, a captive lion, before whose cage they may display their hatred and derision. Nothing that is signed, promised, or sworn by kings, emperors, or the Pope is valid without the counter-signature of the aristocrats, and never will they give it. Thus Napoleon, who, because he was supreme, believed that all the other monarchs were such as himself, that their word was valid, and their authority real, pledging himself to one and to another of them, became their intended dupe, and the first deception practiced upon him was one to which he offered himself as a victim: the consecration. How many contradictions, hesitations, and abortive maneuvers there are in this consecration! It is vain to seek a reason for certain acts. Is there a reason? For instance, the consecration and coronation of Josephine. It was a whim that Napoleon wished to vex his brothers and sisters, and he intended to redeem the wrongs done to his wife by associating her in his glory. These are not reasons. There were none. Not even a historical excuse. If Napoleon had opened the history of France, he would have seen that the coronation of queens had been discontinued for 2 centuries. In the 13th and 14th centuries, several queens were crowned, from Blanche of Castile, wife of Louis the 13th, to Jeanne de Bourbon, first wife of Charles V, thenceforth for 250 years. From 1364 to 1610, there was no coronation of a queen. Marie de Medici was an exception, and this solitary example was not very encouraging. Even admitting that she took no part in the affair of the Rue de la Ferronnerie, the coincidence was too startling for there to be much desire to renew such ceremonies while the Bourbons were on the throne. There was no coronation, therefore, for Anne of Austria, Maria Theresa of Austria, Maria Leczinska, or Marie Antoinette. The last name was present but did not take part in the consecration of Louis XVI. Thus, there was not even the excuse of the reestablishment of one of the traditional ceremonies by which Napoleon sought to create a link between the old and new form of government. Still more decided was the inconsistency between the two positions which he offered to Josephine. He crowned but did not intend to marry her. Was one of these ties less powerful than the others? In order that the Pope might consecrate Josephine, it was necessary that he should be ignorant of the fact that she was not married. What a mortification if the Pope were to hear of it for the coronation. If afterwards, what a scandal. And Napoleon did not think of this. He certainly established an intercourse between Josephine and the Pope and managed the affair cleverly. They wrote letters and briefs, exchanged presents, and complimented each other by correspondence. But it was a long way from a mantelpiece or a rosary to a sacrament. The Pope was scrupulous. Even if he had not been, he would have had to observe the proprieties. The supreme pontiff of the Catholics, he could not have knowingly infringed one of the fundamental laws of the Catholic discipline. To deceive him, it was useless. Besides being dangerous, what would it lead to? In legislation and politics, Napoleon subordinated everything to these two considerations. Is it just? Is it advantageous? Here, in both cases, the answer was no. Yet, how was it that he did not take into consideration the fact that if it was dangerous to deceive the Pope, and grave inconveniences might arise thereby, a success, supposing he were successful, thus gained by trickery, would not be less prejudicial to Napoleon himself and to Josephine? To himself, because in this way, for the tie of a religious marriage, which he would have shunned, there would be substituted the tie of the coronation, and which was the stronger, if at any time he acquired the proof that he was capable of having children, if he wished for political reasons to contract a marriage for which his destiny might qualify him, his obligations towards Josephine would assume a different character. They would be considerably narrowed and would compel him to a very different display of feelings. And Josephine also, on the heights to which he had drawn her, she was conspicuous to all. And although the society which had passed through the revolution was scarcely fastidious, yet for all that it could not help gossiping about what Josephine had done. Little was known of her lovers before 1786. All that was obscure and escaped the notice of the scandalmongers. The separation from Beauharnais was known, and that was all. But after 1788, her adventures were far more famous, and she had frequented a society which had attracted a good deal of attention. She had lived with well-known men who were celebrated, even illustrious, while at the same time she had engaged in certain vulgar and degrading intrigues. The most casual investigation of her past would reveal some strange personages with whom she had had all kinds of affairs. Was it not a most astonishing and useless piece of bravado to prevent such a woman to the nation in the most august of ceremonies to consecrate and crown her? If Napoleon was not aware of all her career, he knew enough of it and had suffered enough from it to have no doubt, at least concerning the later episodes. What advantage was there in adding to the numerous enmities he had incurred and criticisms that he ignored, or ridicule which he was bringing upon himself? But this he would show what contempt he felt for the world and even the half-world. Thus, by the apotheosis of an adventuress whose career was notorious to all Paris, he would arouse the laughter of those to whose opinions he seemed to attach more importance. That he should delight in astonishing the world was excellent, but what was the use in setting himself to flout it upon his glory, which aroused wonder, devotion, and hatred? but at which no one was tempted to mock, he interrupted his scandally excited merriment. Why? Doubtless because he had no sense of humor. He calmly did what no Parisian, no European would have dared. It was enough that the woman was pleasing to him and that he had chosen her. He ignored the respect of mankind and cared nothing for public opinion. Is it comprehensible that he did not shrink from crowning her? Well, what were his reasons for doing so?